Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I am back in my original setup. For those of you who started following me earlier in the year, like in the fall, winter, that time, you only know my dorm as where I film. But this is where I started off with my first Life is Strange cut content, all that stuff. And so I'm back. Audio quality is significantly better. I know, I need to work that out for next year. If anybody has any sound recommendations, let me know. But today's video is about something that I'm very, very passionate about. The Last of Us series is, it's the reason I bought a PlayStation 4. I bought it in 2019 to play The Last of Us 1 and 2. I did it back to back during COVID, and it was so worth it. And it's a game I've become very, very invested in. If you haven't, please check out my Last of Us videos on the TV show, my one specifically about the first 2 episodes and how, from a writing level, they aren't really that strong. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today, we're talking about the cut content from The Last of Us Part 1, and next week, we'll be doing The Last of Us Part 2. A lot of this information is from the Last of Us art book, which I recommend everyone checks out. It has some beautiful illustrations of things that never made it to the game, things that are in the game, and I can't recommend it enough. The other half of this is from a very interesting interview that Neil Druckmann did. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So first, we'll start with some early ideas. When Neil Druckmann was in college, he was inspired by George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, as well as another game called Ico, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, but it was a zombie game. He was inspired by that, as well as the main character from Sin City, and all of those things together birthed what would eventually become The Last of Us. In this original idea, the story would follow a cop who is tasked with protecting a young girl. However, the cop has a sort of heart condition which can flare up now and again and would have the player change from controlling him to controlling the girl. And the story would basically go of how she becomes more and more responsible, learning more and more from him, and eventually has to protect him. And so when The Last of Us was in development, this is what really drove a lot of the creative decisions. We see that in The Last of Us, it really is a coming-of-age story about Ellie who learns more about survival from Joel, just like this unnamed girl would have from this police officer. Now, let's get into some of the stuff from the art book. In a lot of the artwork throughout this book, we see infected. Most of it is focused on the characters or the environment, but they're mostly always interacting with infected. And it's very interesting to see how they've changed. If you look at some of the drawings where Marlene is fighting an infected, or Joel, or whoever, the infected look very, very different from how they do in the current game. When I first saw it, as strange as this may sound, my first impression was this looks like the half-human, half-velociraptor dinosaur from Jurassic Park 4. The sort of flattened heads, the sharp teeth, the way the jaw kind of goes back and it's not like covered in skin, it's much more reptilian. Just the overall build of these creatures reminded me of that. But it turns out the reasoning behind it is very, very interesting. Instead of the infection growing out and creating these sort of branches and spores that go higher and higher in order to spread the infection, the original idea was that the more that someone got infected, the more fungus would grow on them and force their posture downward. So you can see as the infection increases, they become more and more hunched, more and more heavy and weighed down, and it basically layers over their skin until eventually they would become so overwhelmed with the weight of the spores and fungus on them that they would collapse to the ground and they would become the huge chunks of fungus and infected mass that we see in these buildings. It's such an interesting idea because I love the idea of the fungus slowly taking over the body until it literally cannot move and it's forced to become immobile and then it just spreads from there. I think that's such a fascinating idea. There's some other early attempts where the spores grow out of the back more so than the face, and these end up sort of looking alien. Some of them even ditch the overall humanoid appearance altogether. There's a few that I can only assume it almost looks like an extra set of knees or some sort of centaur type thing, where the legs don't quite look human. Another neat thing about the infected is that at one point in time, there was an enemy called pods. These things would sit on the ceilings and on the walls of buildings and sort of shoot something out to pull in a human and infect them. They would operate in a similar way that the creatures in Half-Life Alyx do, or I guess Half-Life in general, where they can grab items, you can throw items at them, it'll grab it and reel it up, that kind of thing. Early drawings of Ellie are very, very interesting. She was always going to be a teenage girl with a ponytail. That's something that hadn't really changed throughout development. But one of the things that I find very interesting is the type of clothing that she wears. In a lot of her early artwork, Ellie wears a lot of baggy and hooded clothes. Multiple layers of clothing. She's shown pulling her hood down as she walks by people. I think this is fascinating because it sets her up as being more of a loner and living in a less structured society. In the current game, Ellie went to school. Ellie knew other kids. She wasn't surviving on the streets on her own. So she wore typical kid clothing. Graphic t-shirts, long sleeves, jeans. But in this version, she looks closer to what your average survivor would look like. Which is why I believe in this early version, the QZ, or whatever settlement that they were living in, was not nearly as organized as the QZ that we see in the final game. It must have been much more lawless, with a lot more roving gangs and violence, and maybe Fedra wasn't even really a thing at this point. So Ellie needed to sort of hide her identity of being a young, alone girl in this apocalypse. She would need to hide that because people would try to come after her for that and view her as weak. So that character design, those early outfits are very telling of the world we would have been in this earlier idea. There's some early drawings of Marlene with Joel leaning down next to her as if she's hurt. This could have been when Marlene was hurt and she first hands off Ellie, or maybe this is some sort of cut death where she dies early on. Now let's get into some of the other concept art. These apply more so to the environments and levels. For the QZ itself, various other cities were considered, East Coast cities such as New York, Philadelphia, as well as Pittsburgh, which would end up in the final game. However, Boston was decided on. In an interesting piece of concept art, we see what appears to be a gate to the outside world. We see guards wearing special hazmat suits with protective armor. They also have guns, and they're shown basically shaking down a truck that's coming through. What's interesting about that is we see the inter-gates between the sections of the QZ. However, we don't really see where the trade between QZs, where they enter into each other. So for example, in the show as well as in the game, we know that different QZs, the ones that are still around, trade with each other. They share supplies. One will produce this, the other will produce that, and they trade. But it's something we'd never really get to see the process of. We never see the gate where they intake these trucks, these transports of goods from Atlanta, from wherever this other QZ is. And I think it's really interesting that in this art we do. In the game, when Joel, Ellie, and Tess escape the QZ, they're caught by a guard who tests them all to see if they're infected. Ellie obviously freaks out, stabs the guard, and this guard ends up dying at the hands of Joel, both in the TV show and in the video game. After that, they find out that Ellie is infected because they pick up the scanner device. In this early concept art, we see Ellie handcuffed using a zip tie, Tess seemingly panicked with a car that is on. We can see the backlight on. In this early version, it appears that they would have stolen some sort of vehicle from Fedra, and Ellie would have been handcuffed. And it makes me wonder that if in a later section, maybe Ellie breaks free and kills an infected, or something happens where Ellie needs to step up to sort of prove herself to Joel and Tess that, hey, I'm not a liability. You shouldn't be handcuffing me. I need to be able to fight. And I think that would have been a very interesting character beat. In the Pittsburgh section of the game, it appears that there was going to be a sort of neutral faction of locals. And when I say neutral, I mean like not necessarily hostile, but I don't think Joel and Ellie would be walking around this town. You can see that there were concept arts for campsites in sort of very well-known areas in Pittsburgh. And the reason I say that I think they would be neutral is because on the following page, we get a whole different section about the hunters, who are the raiders that we end up fighting. Early concept art of the town of Jackson is very different from what we end up getting. In the background skyline, you can see a city, or at the very least, a very populated area. This would make Jackson a much more fragile community because they would be close to what used to be a major population center. However, in the other concept art, we see what we would end up getting, which is sort of this town hidden in a valley in the middle of nowhere. In the University of Eastern Colorado section of the games, the university is something that doesn't really exist. While the mascot they chose is in reference to another university in the area, this specific college doesn't exist. So they looked at a lot of different universities when considering what they should make it look like. The other interesting thing is the use of the mascot. There were many different versions of the mascot, some more mean looking than others, and one wasn't even a ram like they would end up using. It was some sort of bird, I believe a raven or maybe an eagle. But the final mascot was decided because they wanted to use it as one of the ways that they could show the nostalgia of the world that we've lost. Instead of having it be some mean-looking, grr kind of mascot, they decided on something that was classic, that made you think of older, better times. And I think that was a very smart decision. In the winter section of the game, where Ellie is forced to survive on her own while Joel is recovering from his stab wound, early art shows Ellie with a dog. This is very interesting because in The Last of Us 2, we'll get to that in the next one, but it was also considered that Ellie would have a dog sidekick. In this version, the dog appears to be some sort of beagle or a dog with floppy ears, whereas in The Last of Us 2 art book, the dog is very clearly some sort of shepherd type. They have very pointy ears from what I recall. Like I said, we'll get more into that when I do my part 2 video next week. And finally, when it comes to cut weapons, there's a wide variety of craftable weapons that were interesting combinations of guns and knives, and there was a stop sign weapon that you could use. Many, many different designs that I feel were cut because some of them seem a little unrealistic. I think some of them delve into the sort of Dead Rising category where this is a little ridiculous to assume that Joel and Ellie could just tape this together. Finally, we're going to look at a very interesting interview that delves into some of the very early concepts of The Last of Us Part 1. Neil Druckmann spoke to Game Informer and talked about a very different story for Tess. In his early version of the game, Tess became the antagonist. Tess would feel betrayed by Joel and Ellie either leaving her behind or something going wrong at the Capitol. So Tess would track them down across the country and try to come after them. This sort of darker tone with her would be balanced out by the ending of the game being more hopeful. And the whole reason this was changed was not because Tess being an antagonist was seen as bad storytelling, but because they felt that Joel, someone who would be considered inherently selfish, he's a smuggler who kills to survive. They felt that he wouldn't take on the task of taking Ellie across the country unless something really big motivated him. That being the sacrifice of Tess, someone who's very close to him. Druckmann said, "We had a tough time understanding why Joel would take this journey. We weren't buying it. We also had a hard time buying that Tess would go on a vendetta. We could understand her pursuing Joel a little bit, but why would she go for a year around the country? Those were solved by saying that Tess is going to die when she gets bitten, but her dying wish is Joel to do this one thing. Help me do this one thing so my soul can rest because of all the horrible things I've done." In this version of the game, Ellie's arc was that she didn't kill any people who weren't infected. She would help you fight off infected, but when it came to raiders, the most she would do is like throw a brick or a bottle. This would culminate in when Tess captures Joel and is torturing him, and Ellie is forced to kill her. They also realized that having Ellie not in the combat would make it harder for players to sort of resonate with her. This character isn't helping me on my journey. I'm just having to escort her across the country. That was the worry. So they had to sort of work it in and change the overall arc of her to be, how does being violent, how does being forced to fight for your survival change you as a person? And the original ending, as I said, was a lot more hopeful. Druckmann says, the original ending we pitched for the game was much more hopeful, where Joel and Ellie make it to San Francisco, and that is a town run by people who are trying to restore society. Joel has killed all these doctors and lied to Ellie, and then Ellie just fully buys into the lie. So you're left with this idea that they are going to live the rest of their lives in this town. The camera pulls back, and maybe everything is going to be alright for these two. I was working on writing, and it didn't feel honest anymore. After everything they've done, after everything they've been through, that was letting them get off a little too easy. Especially for Joel. The other interesting thing is that he says the ending that they ended up going with, where Joel massacres the Firefly Hospital and lies directly to Ellie, and she sort of doesn't fully believe him, but she's willing to accept it for the moment. Many people said that was unsatisfying. They didn't think it was a good ending, which is very, very interesting because as time has gone on, it's been viewed as this amazingly powerful ending. And not to mention, it set the stage for part 2, which I would argue has so much more to offer. All that to say, thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate every single one of you. Please leave a like. I'm looking forward to doing Last of Us Part 2 cut content next week, and I hope you have a good morning or evening or, whatever.